All right, I remembered we needed sound. Welcome to Three Things. This is the Tyee's informal interview chat show where we talk to the wonderful folks in our family about three things that are on their mind and what we can all kind of learn from that. My name is Emma Cooper. I am the outreach manager here at the Tyee, and I am broadcasting live from unceded territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. We are live on Zoom, we are on Facebook, we are on YouTube. So if any folks have any questions for our awesome guest today, please ask them early. We have a 30-minute kind of a session. We like to keep it short and sweet for you. So our guest today is Bryan Carney, and we're lucky to have him because he's not only is the head of web at the Tyee, kind of taking care of everything online for us, which is a big deal. He also works as an investigative reporter, and his specialty in areas of interest are privacy and technology. And last year, Andrew McLeod, longtime Tyee reporter and past Three Things guest, which is fun to say, both won the Surveillance Privacy Award from the BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association for their work in reporting on these subjects. So without further ado, let's get this going and welcome Bryan Carney to the live stream.
Hello.
Yes, that was a beautiful entrance. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm not sure why, but the sound suddenly went to my speakers. Let me just reconnect my headphones.
That's cool. You know what? No pressure. You've got the tech. You've got the tech pressure.
Yeah,
like I have excuses. It's a little more high pressure for you. That's great. Excellent. Well, before we get going, Bryan, do you have a show and tell item to show us?
Yeah, I did. I tried to find something sort of apropos. So I found this is what you get many times if you do a federal Freedom of Information access to information request, is you get one of these CD-ROMs mailed to you, and and hopefully within 30 days or maybe a month. And then this is the device I had to buy, a portable CD-ROM reader, because no laptop made in the last decade hardly is able to read those. So that was my.
That is beautiful because that is exactly the level of technology that I assume the government is cruising at. And like, pleased it's not a floppy drive, but it's not the most high tech. Perfect. Well, good on you to work with that technology. And that leads us into the three things that you want to talk about, which is sort of the concentration of power of big tech and what's happening with that in the pandemic, police technology accountability, and also the crisis in the freedom of information sphere. So that's a lot. And the through line and the theme of all of those things is that I know nothing about them. So I'm really in your hands here. What interests you about privacy and technology, just to get things started?
It just makes sense. I mean, and that's sort of where my skills have always been, and what sort of connected my interest in journalism in the first place is I've always kind of had a little bit of a hybrid role in organizations. I worked for sort of journalistic associations in sort of more of a technical role over the years as well. And yeah, I mean, I'm looking at things that on behalf of the Tyee that have, privacy impacts on people. And yeah, I don't know, maybe it's partly to alleviate my guilt for delving into data all day or something. I don't know.
Well, I'm glad I'm not the only one motivated by guilt. Great. Whatever keeps you probing, I guess. So that's great. So you're interested, and again, this is not. I think with the people who are going to listen to this are either super like deep into this with you, or they don't really know. So we'll try to give an overview, but also answer some really specific questions. And if you do have them on Zoom, please ask them in the question and answer box. So as far as the big tech companies, your Amazons, your Facebooks, your Googles, you're talking about a concentration of power. Could you tell me more about that and why that's so important to pay attention to now?
I just think we're still really sort of unpacking. We're already undergoing a pretty massive experiment in just the number, just when you look at the sheer number of hours that everybody is sort of spending online, and as there's sort of a gradual shift been towards various platforms, and they sort of exchange numbers a little bit, and as one gets to a certain level that threatens another. They tend to be bought out by the existing companies. You just sort of seen the turmoil that people are still unpacking about some of the larger elections around the world. And, the legislation just hasn't really kept up, with the tactics that are being used to influence elections. And we were still unpacking all of that, I think, in a lot of ways, and understanding it better, and what people have been up to. And then this sort of happened where, the most reasonable thing we can do to address a pandemic is to sort of cut out a lot of the remaining interaction we had that doesn't pass through one of, very few companies that, they don't just pass, an A to A version of messages through. They play a really important role in filtering, through their algorithms. That's the value of these companies generally, right? It's just the algorithm, as people say. And it just determines, which kinds of content are gonna float up to the top. And it was already a very important thing when there was still a lot of opportunities for you to have exchanges that weren't influenced by those companies. And just, we're still sort of getting the statistics on just how much people have gone online increasingly since the pandemic hit. But, like the companies like Amazon have, doubled their profit, and the Jeff Bezos has doubled his personal fortune, and Facebook could hardly keep up with the demand on its platform in the months after it started. There's just a lot of this coming out, and I just think it's important for us to just remember how to flex sort of those muscles that maybe are getting lost a little bit. The exercise of kind of keeping your own algorithms of, like what deciding. You can have this sort of phenomena that everybody's probably familiar with who's on social media, where you might have met somebody once and connected with them, or have, a casual acquaintance and ended up connecting with them on social media. And you may have had them on there for several years without ever actually interacting with them, and yet feel like you have a pretty good sense of what's going on in their life. But, what you're going to see is going to be really influenced by what is engaging, and what benefits these platforms in order to keep eyeballs on them, and so on. And I just think that it's just a massive crazy experiment that we're all going through, that is going to take a while to unpack. And we were still unpacking the depth of that experiment before this went down, and it just kind of went into warp speed. So I just think it's important to think about, reach out to your friends directly. Think about those conversations you used to have with your coworkers now and then. I know we don't talk to each other at the Tyee, so it doesn't matter, but it's we just talk via Slack, even in person.
This is a misty, human-based way for you to start this, and I like that. You're going slow and reflect on things is the motto that we need to go with. But you're talking about how algorithms are now in between us and our friends, and so many aspects of our life that it's hard to kind of keep that top of mind, and we're getting used to it, is what I'm hearing. So,
yeah.
And then that's moved up the ladder with the pandemic, and so it's hard to kind of keep a unbiased perspective when we're kind of just all swimming in that in a very weird context right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, I just thought that was the theme that kind of tied the other two together.
So if that's kind of the landscape that we're sort of swimming in, getting used to, now it's the water, what does that kind of tell us about, as you've done some investigative work with police technology accountability, can you tell me a little bit about that work to get started?
Sure. Yeah, it's sort of a logical next step to think about if practically every human exchange is being done, online in a far greater degree now, then you start thinking about who has access to, data and metadata that connects those kinds of experiences. And, we pick on the police a lot because, those are the actors you tend to think about, and they're ones that we can actually get information from, because they're public bodies in a way. And so I mean, some of the work that I did, the one that really got me motivated to dig in more was finding out about a program called Project Wide Awake, which was an RCMP is an RCMP program that, just when I got the Freedom of Information return, allowed me to sort of look at how it progressed, from something that was designed to sort of react to investigations, to scenarios that were coming, to, the language shifted inside the department to saying, okay, actually, no, it's going to be a proactive way to monitor Canadians' use of social media and throughout the web, and, identify threats and possibly stop them before they happen. And yeah,
so it's very sci-fi, but you probably need some policy and things like that in place if that's what we're going to be doing.
Yeah, exactly. And so sorry, go ahead.
So you investigated this, and the RCMP wasn't necessarily forthcoming with that they were using technology from Clearview AI, and that eventually came out because of pushing and probing. And what, for the average citizen, what should they be thinking about in terms of their own information in regards to the police and their own privacy?
I guess, it's just good for them it'd be good if we had more policies, if these kinds of policies and practices were released sort of proactively from police. And I think that was sort of the overarching theme that I noticed when I went through, the history of the pattern of what tends to happen with these types of things is that in some way or another, there's a leak, or it's revealed, that there's this police program that's using new technology or applying the technology in a new way. And there's sort of the panic. And then, the way our sort of privacy system works is that if somebody makes a complaint, the privacy commissioner will, do an inquiry on that complaint, and then something will be released. And then in a matter of time, there'll be recommendations, and oftentimes the public sort of moved on, and so have the police, onto a new technology by then. We saw that with the drone programs used by the RCMP, and with Clearview AI, and with this with Project Wide Awake. And just when I sort of looked into how we try to address that in the first place, the framework that we have is probably pretty good if it was actually enforced and used, which is a privacy impact assessment that's applies to all departments, not just the RCMP. That if you're using a technology of some kind, or a program that has the possibility of impacting citizens' privacy, you're supposed to, before implementing it, is sort of the key of the design, create these privacy impact assessment that goes to elected government to look at and actually approve, and provide recommendations on changes that may need to happen. And what I found, which some people had commented on before, BC Civil Liberties Association especially, is that these companies, the RCMP in particular, because I was looking into them, will sort of play with that language around implemented. And so they'll have these programs that are sort of, they'll call internally either testing or design phase is another one. There's no real, they move through a series of, phases of programs that don't really seem to align to any known way of, moving programs into action in government departments or police forces that I was able to determine. And what happens is, while they're being called design, and while there's no privacy impact yet report prepared, because they're not implemented, they're in testing, they're still being used immediately in active investigations with no obvious limits on what they're able to do. And so if the procedure was actually enforced, and there was some talk of this with the just as the Trudeau government got in to start to make these impact assessments, strengthen the law behind them to make them a requirement, before and probably have to straighten out some language that I think what needs to happen is to say that if something is not implemented and hasn't passed this test that we designed, then it shouldn't be possible to use it on citizens at all.
So what I'm hearing with that is with some of these big tech companies like the Amazons and Googles and things, there's often moving so fast that our legislation is almost having a hard time keeping up. But in the case of police technology accountability, we actually have some legislation and the privacy impact assessment that could really do the job if it's maybe beefed up a bit and really enforced. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think so. Yeah. So the legislation is there, and we're going to go through many more iterations of this, this standard play where, in the case of Clearview, we had, a New York Times revelation that it was being used by a bunch of police forces in the US. And then in one little quote somewhere, there was a testimonial from Canadian law enforcement, and everybody, suspected the RCMP and, pressed them for answers, including us at the Tyee. And they more or less said, no, we don't use any facial recognition. They told the CBC that directly. And it turned out when it was obvious that the client list was going to be leaked, the RCMP said, oh, actually, yeah, it turns out we were using it. And, they identified the unit that was using had to do with sex crimes, but there was actually also 5 other units that we still don't know who they are, who were using this technology. So I think that we're going to continue to see this unroll over and over again every time there are conferences that police experts attend. Then they're being sold all kinds of latest greatest technology for crime fighting, and that's it's very beneficial. We want police to be able to catch criminals, but I just think that it seems to me that it always, whenever I've looked into this, it comes back to that privacy impact assessment strengthening the use of that.
Well, that makes sense to me. Thank you for breaking it down in a way that makes sense to me. And so that kind of transitions into the last piece of this, which is where we're starting to see some very specific and excited questions coming up, which is these sort of talking about your process with filing freedom of information requests, or FOIs. Now, could you walk through, as an example, your process of, did you file an FOI for learning a little more about Project Wide Awake?
Yeah, that's how I found out about it. I was casting, sort of a wider net around just tech companies in government, and it was just, this came out of, it's a good example of how these things tend to be discovered. It was originally a complaint that somebody had about stingrays, they're devices that police can use to listen to all the cell phone. They tricks cell phones basically into locking onto them, and they can see all of your, what's going on in your phone data. And because of the complaint, an inquiry was launched by the privacy commissioner, and they asked the RCMP, what kinds of programs do you have of this nature that may, and they said, they just mentioned in a small section this Project Wide Awake, which sounded, so interesting to me.
It's a fun, ominous name, I'm not gonna lie. This
Yeah.
just gives me a visual of police officers up all night just looking at our faces. That's where my brain goes. All right. So it's like you get a little corner of information. You want to investigate further. And could you walk through some of the basic steps of filing an FOI?
Yeah, it's quite, cool. It is designed to be quite simple. It is a quick process. If I've done overwhelmingly mostly federal ones, and so the access to information and privacy. ATIP, if you type ATIP, look up, you can just Google that, ATIP, file ATIP, and it'll guide you through. Probably, the initial hurdle when you're new to it is that probably needs a little bit of work on the government's information part, is figuring out which department is responsible for the area that you want to look into. Once you have the correct department, you can get an information officer when you file it. But figuring that out it can be a challenge, and then they might bounce you from the old system to the new system that they're migrating. But essentially, it involves filling out a form online that's at the bottom part of which says what are the records you're looking for. And there are lots of guidelines you get into, and you can reach out to organizations that are advocates for this, like the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association in BC, who could probably give you better resources on this. But it essentially, you're asking a question of the government and seeing what they come back with for you, and just sort of getting better at it.
Well, and then we have a very descriptive question coming in via email from Marlene that is asking you, as a Native member of the public, I knew nothing of FOIs and access to information, et cetera, until about 2 years ago when I first filed an FOI request. What I've seen in these last 2+ years is much less transparency and very onerous processes for the public to access information. In 2018, one could browse through a spreadsheet with all of the FOI requests. There was a summary of each request attached so that at a glance one could easily scan certain ministries to see if someone else had requested similar info. At a glance, one could see how long some of the requests were taking, and since the status of each request was clearly shown. In late 2018 or early 2019, this spreadsheet changed, and there was no summaries of what an FOI request is regarding. So Marlene's asking sort of how does this happen? How does this help with open information? And this is to do with the BC government. She's been filing FOIs with the BC government. So what would you say to that? I know some of the questions are going to come really specific, and you don't happen to have to have every single answer.
I mean, I've noticed that. I haven't noticed that in particular with the BC government. I've admittedly done a lot. I've done a lot less of the provincial ones than federal. I have noticed in general that when you're trying to find posted Freedom of Information requests that have already been done, that it's very unreliable. Just about every department I've visited, whether provincial or federal, to have them show up on the the timeline that they might have a policy that they show that after 5 days or something like this. They're very inconsistent sort of across departments. I asked FIPA, the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association in BC very quickly, like if they've sort of noticed in the province as well what people are talking about in federally. And they did say that there has been a slowdown for sure, just anecdotally from its membership, that people are finding just it's a bit slower to respond, which maybe is to be expected with staff reductions. But there's still the data is still a little bit out on that, and there should be a lot better data coming out soon about how much of an impact that's had on requests.
So, again, for people thinking about FOIs, it's going to be a little bit different depending on what part of the government or what level of the government you're kind of asking for information from. And you said you're more familiar with the federal FOI process. What have been the critiques, and what is sort of the state of access to information at a federal level?
Well, I mean, the commissioner responsible, Carolyn Maynard, has said a few months ago that we're reaching a point that this may not be possible to fix this. It's really gotten bad in terms of the backlog that for people waiting for requests, and yeah, I mean, I've certainly noticed that it's very in the last year or so, to a very noticeable degree. It's the odds that you're going to get something within the guidelines set out in the Act are less and less, and you may not even just get a letter requesting it. So there's a lot going on right now that suggests this is a really big window of opportunity for change in this, because this has been a problem long before. The pandemic just sort of really made this a lot worse, because there were a lot of departments that shut down their information responding departments in government departments. So I mean, it got a lot worse, but there also is a review about to happen initiated by the Treasury Department of the entire program. In BC, there's a review that's about to happen about on the legislation as well. I mean, that
we love a good review in Canada.
Yeah.
When things seem to be in a bad place, we said let's have some tea and do a review.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's sort of like language for we're doing something, so leave us alone until this comes up again. And that was sort of my thinking on raising this issue. Is just that with this sort of window of opportunity, I think what really needs to happen is somehow this super nerdy, boring sounding topic has to appear to be of interest to voters. I just think somehow that bridge has to be gapped, where this is, people's eyes start to glaze over when you say ATIP.
I like that you said appeared interest, like there's not even a hope that it's going to directly interest people.
It has to be visible. I should say visible interest, a tangible interest. In just, I mean, the sort of a lot of the big stories that come out that people do care about in that get reported by journalists, it come from access to information, and there's definitely just a slowing of access to that kind of information that enables people to participate in democracy. It's a very important part of your ability to understand what your government is up to, and I think that it's a very challenging question to figure out how to get people to care enough that this became a voting issue. I'm not sure how to do that.
Yeah. And I think it would stand with a lot of other things as well, when it's something that's part of democracy that's really critical, but it's a process piece. Sometimes that's challenging to pull people in, but that's why we're talking about it here. There's a question that came in that says, why don't governments just put more of this information online to reduce the FOI backlog?
That's a really good question, and that's one I have been looking into recently about all of the sort of failed starts in open government initiatives that have happened over the years and it follows a fairly similar trajectory that emphasis on access to information does, which is that governments campaign on them prior to elections and very quickly change positions, especially if there's a change in government, where obviously if you're an opposition party, you want to be able to access as much as you can, and there are embarrassing details of government. So there have been various efforts by the Treasury and trying to think what other institutions have open government initiatives has been the sort of the federal name, and that's basically the last big push that I could see was when the Trudeau government got in, and then it very quickly seemed to fade, where there was an interest in having a lot more proactive, a lot more information released proactively. And if you go on to Open Government Canada, you'll see, there are people make this who are very good at watching for what gets released through that, and I think there has been improvements. But when you look at sort of the kinds of statements that were made around massively improving that when the Trudeau government got in, I think it's fairly clear that they haven't really kept up with that, just as with ATIP promises.
Right. Now, I got a couple quick hit, really specific questions about FOIs. You're either going to know them because you've already gone through the process yourself, or you won't. But here we go. Josette asks, are we allowed to access the credentials previous professional experience for public servants in BC?
Sorry, say that again.
Are we allowed access to credentials and previous professional experience for public servants in BC?
I'm not sure about that. Yeah, no, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think you necessarily have a right to that. No, I mean, you'd have to check what the circumstance is. Maybe if there was a document in, if there was a procurement for a position or something like that, and you're able to get access to some of the consideration documents, but I would probably expect that wouldn't. But yeah, sorry, I don't claim to know the answer to that one.
It's like we're getting real specific. You either know it, you don't, you're in the hot seat. Another one from Josette. She said, I received the famous CD from Health Canada, which is what you showed us at the start. Some emails have a purple category. Do you know what this means? Deadly specific. Do you know what the purple category means?
No, I'm sorry.
All right, well,
I don't.
We might have to put this into an email chain, but I thought it was worth a shot. We've got another question from Kenneth, who has a statement that says AI systems should continuously improve transparency, explainability, reliability, and controllability, and gradually achieve auditability, supervisability, traceability, and trustworthiness. That's so many abilities. That's an excerpt from from an ethics statement produced by China's National Committee on AI Experts. And that was quoted in a New Yorker article in August. Now, whatever the language and its source, what legislative provisions would you recommend to enable Canadian governance and regulatory enforcement of online entities, big and small? So any kind of recommendations around enforcement of online entities?
I think that just, I mean, when we were talking about open government, I mean, sort of what's happened when you talk to departments about what sort of happened that's made it really awful in the last few years, I think, is that they've improved the systems for submitting requests because we're talking about, you know, digital documents 99% of the time now. And so you can make your requests with all these revamped new systems, and then it has to go to a person who's using a lot of antiquated, you know, procedures like sending emails and scanning sending CD-ROMs rather and scanning. But I think that the possibilities for sort of reversing the onus, where, you know, if an action is being done by the government and you know, I think that should be available and searchable without a human interaction, unless it is flagged as something that, you know, needs to be secret for, you know, for all the varying reasons that it would. And I think there's a lot of room for a lot more of that as these initiatives have themselves identified. So I think it's one of those situations where it's like the answer to that is already available in a lot of the initiatives that were started in government. So what's really needed is just for the public to care enough that it becomes a voting issue. I think, anyways, that will follow through on some of these ideas. That, you know, if there's a policy, or if there's you know, communication and that sort of thing, it should be available by default.
Gotcha. Well, that makes sense. And Kenneth follows up with a little bit of a clarification, saying that my question was a little bit more about regulating folks like Facebook and Twitter and so on, and any other online sources of media, which is, I mean, that's a big question that I think they're having tribunals about, and you know, you're not expected to solve that because that's a big one.
Like policy around regulating that kind of thing, we're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of a big question. I mean, the one thing that we know, there's a ton of lobbying happening about decisions that might be made about that. I guess that have a little bit more to do with the amount of sort of influence that some of these companies have in terms of the market share, like Facebook. And we know there's a lot of consideration around you know, competitive. The Competition Bureau and that sort of thing that are likely to sort of unfold next year. And we saw the first sort of action on that in that file in a while from the Competition Bureau with regard to Amazon. But yeah, I'm not sure specific ones I would point to with regard to other than, I mean, there was just a report that I was reading earlier this morning from Avaz that sort of looked at Facebook's efforts to be a bit to take down misleading information and just how it compares to their own algorithms that, you know, promote sort of articles that you know, that tend to be controversial and that do contain misinformation, and advise you to join groups and that sort of thing that have known misinformation. And it just seems that the efforts that are being made by these tech companies are sort of nowhere comparing to, you know, what is essentially in their interest to promote sort of the most controversial kinds of engaging content, which often is misinformation.
We got work to do. Last question. We're going a little over time. There's lots of great questions, so thank you for asking them and for tuning in. This is from Sarah, although we did have a comment from Nathan, who's also expressing some solidarity and having a hard time getting some of the information he needs out of certain processes and certain government bodies. Sarah asks, why do you think the public interest in this isn't greater? Do you think it's too complex, or is it just ignorance as to how important it is?
That's a really tough question. I mean, it still is. I mean, it's simple enough for somebody to go and make these requests, but there still is a lot. I mean, oh yeah, we were going to use this. We talked about this analogy of going into a blind restaurant, right? Where it's sort of an absurd situation when you don't have proactive disclosure, because what you're doing is going in not knowing what documents may possibly exist or how the government works, and then asking for something in there. You know, it's sort of like, I don't know what you have there, but do you have anything with this? And give it to me. And so in order to make useful requests from the government, you really have to build up some expertise. I mean, anybody can just, you know, throw something out there and see what you get. But there are so many tricks that people who, you know, who have been doing these things for years, you know, there's a lot of investigative reporters who specialize in this, and, you know, in people in government, in opposition parties and that sort of thing. There just sort of are a lot of tricks and barriers that sort of prevent you from even knowing what to look for. I think that's sort of one of the main things that I think proactive disclosure, if you know, if we can get the public behind that as a first step to start to recognize the kinds of things and, you know, where this kind of information is being exchanged in government, so you know what to look for. I think that has a lot to do with it. It's just sort of, I mean, one thing that I think is unfortunate about the way that this works is that in some ways it's not in the interest of journalists who do specialize in this to help the public. I mean, because it's sort of like a trade secret, right? And that, you know,
it's a skill that allows you to get to the best story.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to suggest that. I mean, I think most journalists who work in this definitely have an interest in advocacy around getting people more interested. But on the other hand, if you're a lot of times where I see stories when I've inquired further and find out that they've, you know, gotten it through a freedom of information request, it won't even say at the top of the story. It'll just say, you know, documents obtained by the news institution. And, you know, maybe they assume that's boring to people, but I think there's also, you know, you don't just want to alert to all of your competing you know, institutions that you can just, I mean, maybe go to the board of previously done requests and get the same scoop as me, and maybe, you know, beat me out to some. So I think there is some there's some value to quite a number of people in having it a little bit complex to do these kinds of requests. I don't want to say that's the main thing. I think it's mainly just that it's just a challenging thing by the nature of the beast to have. You have to have government operating. You can't have them bogged down in constantly releasing everything. You know, this is representative democracy. These are professionals with expertise in their field. You get a lot of requests that, if you look through completed requests, you get a lot of requests that are just very difficult to field and show that people don't necessarily understand how the government works is complex. So I think it's mainly just it's one of those problems that of relaying complex information. But I think the trick is to first get people interested in a lot more proactive disclosure. Personally.
Well, and there's hope for that, because we were using the analogy when we were talking the other day about, like you said, almost those restaurants where everyone is in darkness, and usually the patrons of the restaurant are often sighted and the servers are blind, so they're used to navigating in this maybe darker landscape. And normally if you went to one of those restaurants, you would get sort of a menu and things would come out to you. Filing an FOI is almost like sitting in that dark restaurant, not knowing what kind of restaurant it really is, and not getting a menu, and then just kind of having to play 20 questions until you kind of get towards food. Maybe they don't have food that day. Maybe the food's redacted. I ran with a metaphor. So it's, you know, that's a hard thing for people to wrap their head around, and what I'm hearing. It's also a waiting game because there's a certain amount of patience involved. But I think it's neat that you got into that without some sort of formal training and continue to produce great stories with that. And the thing that I'm hearing about the through line between everything here is that whether it's a big company like a Facebook or a Google or an Amazon or police, or our own government, that good solid legislation and people who care about that and ask questions can actually help us kind of have the institutions that we need to kind of take care of us. So that's my takeaway from that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah,
Trying
I
to
think
wrap it
that's
up.
totally. I think that's a great summary.
Great. Well, thank you so much for, again, taking the time, Bryan. And again, we're going to take a break with three things for next week. I'll be away, but we'll be back in early September, September 2nd, with our editor-in-chief, Robin Smith. So see you then, and thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.